Welcome to Design to Disrupt, Samsung's podcast where we dive into the big ideas redefining tomorrow's supply chain and procurement landscape. Each episode, bold leaders join us to share fresh insights, real-life stories, and practical tools to keep you ahead. So get ready to disrupt the ordinary and design the future. Let's dive in. Now, our audience knows that on Design to Disrupt, we like to bring bold leaders to this mic, people who have actually done the thing and not just talked about it. My next guest has done things at scale most people can barely imagine, from the trading floors of Wall Street's biggest financial institutions to the corridors of Florida state government, from the boardrooms of Silicon Valley unicorns to the front lines of the U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. A trusted mentor and friend to me personally for over 15 years, Jack Miles has led procurement transformations at CIBC, AIG, Cigna, and Computer Associates, managing billions in global spend. He was appointed by Governor Rick Scott as Secretary of Florida's Department of Management Services, overseeing $2.5 billion in budget and accountability for over $9.5 billion in spend, which I think is probably more than that. He was a charter advisory board member for both Coupa Software and DocuSign, watching both ring the NASDAQ bell. And today, he advises the next generation of AI procurement technology as an executive advisor at Orchestro, and serves on the advisory council of the Crack Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. Jack, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ian. It's a pleasure to be here and quite an honor, so I appreciate it.
Thank you. So I have to start off here. Most people in procurement get into it because they followed a fairly predictable path. You, on the other hand, started your career on a flight deck, so it doesn't naturally go straight towards procurement. You went Naval Air Station Miramar, U.S. Independence, Guantanamo Bay. So how on earth do you go from Guantanamo on a flight deck to one of the most consequential procurement leaders of this generation? Was there a moment somewhere in between that you said, I should be buying things for a living, and you thought, that sounds about right?
Well, thanks for that. It's been an interesting journey for sure, and it actually started in prep school. My first 2 years of high school, I went to prep school, St. Thomas More in Colchester, Connecticut, and my parents had a concern about me because I was a lousy student. The common comment was always, if he'd only applied himself, he's such a nice boy. And I just wanted to do stuff. And going to prep school actually unleashed that in me because being away, there was an opportunity to basically do stuff, which is what I wanted to do. When you're in prep school, you got the students are waiting on tables and that because it's kind of a group thing. Well, I had to manage that process within the kitchen and kind of teach them what they were supposed to do. I wound up working on they had a switchboard, if you will, but just a couple of phones. I wound up doing that. And I also babysat for some of the staff. So I was always doing something, which was the sweet spot for me. As a matter of fact, one of the memories that I have is my parents coming up on the first Parents' Day. And I met them in the parking lot. Jim Hanrahan, who was the headmaster, was there. He walked up to my dad and he said, "Mr. Miles," he said, "your son is just amazing. He's doing this, he's doing that, he's doing the other thing." And my father turned to my mother and said, $4,500 a year, and he's working for the guy. The Navy became I didn't know what to do when I got out of high school. Didn't know what I wanted to do for myself. My grades weren't great, so that could have been a challenge. But there's always a school you can get into. But I thought that would be a total waste if I didn't know what to do. So myself and actually 3 buddies decided to go in the Navy. We kind of chose the Navy because it's a little bit better than the Army or the Marines, if you will. And we went to boot camp together and stuff like that. And there were some leadership roles even. When you go into boot camp, you wind up in a company. I was the assistant recruit petty officer chief, so that got me out of a lot of work and a lot of stuff that you really didn't want to do in boot camp. I actually wanted to go to air traffic control school, and at the graduation time, that didn't happen. They had put a hold on the school for some reason. And I wound up going into hydraulics. So I went to Memphis, Tennessee, there, and hydraulic school. And mechanics is not something that was big on my list. So what I got an opportunity to do within that is kind of do different stuff. And that kind of migrated into being the flight deck troubleshooter much later on. But we wound up going to NAS Miramar, basically Top Gun, because it was the F-8s that we were flying, and then to Guantanamo Bay. And Guantanamo Bay, we did search air rescue flights in the Caribbean. And, there were a lot of shallow water sailors who would go down there and get themselves in trouble, and we'd have to go find them. So I was a plane captain on helicopters, wound up in Quonset Point, Rhode Island with a helicopter squadron. As a matter of fact, sort of sadly, the helicopter that went down and the individual that was recently lost, he was actually the commanding officer of the helicopter squadron. I was in HS-5. Wow. So, but, did med cruises, wound up in Puerto Rico, and, started to go to college when I was in the Navy, and finished up when I got out.
Really interesting. What a great background, Jack. One of the things that I thought about when I was preparing for, our discussion was really, you've been in it for a long time. You've kind of seen a lot of things, but so many organizations still kind of treat procurement like it's just the department that argues about a discount or an invoice or whatever it may be. You've spent this 30 plus years trying to change that perception at some of the largest organizations. And I'd wager you still hear some of the same complaints today that you did back then. To me, even in my place, not as many years, it still stings a little bit. So how is it that an entire profession can spend 3 decades, fighting for a seat at the table and still kind of be having the same argument?
Well, let me make the proclamation that I've made many times. There is no table. So yes, hearing the same things over and over again, it does get kind of old. And it's actually quite sad because people have to make this job what they want it to be. A lot of times there's, procurement reports into the wrong function, and that can be part of the challenge. I don't think procurement generally does a good job of telling the story. They're telling and they're not selling. People, if you make their jobs easier and you do things that are good for them, they'll gravitate towards you and they'll do it. It's not complicated. But you also need support from the top of the house. And, what I found over the years is that, obviously relationships change and people come and go. But, a lot of times when you get a change at the top of the house and they don't feel as positively about the function as you think they should, you've got the opportunity to kind of get them on side. And if you can't, you know what, it's not going to work. I think one of the challenges out there is that, people are going into jobs. And I never went into a job. I went into a role, a function, and in most of the cases, it was a function that needed to change. When folks say, what do you do? I used to say that if everything was humming along fine and procurement was great and the company was doing awesome, you wouldn't find me there, because most of the places that I wound up had some sort of a challenge going on, whether it was Travelers, whether it was CIBC, any of those companies had a bit of a challenge that they needed to get fixed. And the engagement from the top of the house was critical to get that done. My dad always used to say everybody needs a rabbi, and he wasn't saying that in the religious sense. It was just that you need somebody out there to look after you. And in a sense, in a procurement role, you really need that, because you're doing a lot of heavy lifting, and you're changing a lot of perceptions. And frankly, you're doing things that many folks in the organization don't want you to do, right? And they'll come gunning for you.
It's a good point. Very good point. You've really been also on the front edge of almost all the big technology waves in the industry specific to procurement. Going back to the late 90s at CIBC, when everybody else was kind of still drowning in paper and spreadsheets. And I got to say, it was another 15 years before even people thought about what you did. But you made a bet on Ariba, at a time when e-procurement wasn't a word, wasn't even a concept, wasn't anything. So you had billions of dollars to spend that you're betting on. And for the first time, you can actually see it after you implemented Ariba. What does that exact moment feel like for a first time? When you had Ariba, you put it up and you said, I can actually see what we're spending. And then what did that moment teach you about the relationship between technology and procurement transformations?
Yeah, great question. And I've thought about this a lot, especially after the fact, and kind of going through how did this all come about. But, at the time, CIBC was making a play to move into the U.S. And the CFO, who I reported to and very involved, obviously, in my hiring, had just finished doing a whole review and re-implementation of the financial systems to prepare the bank to be able to deal with things in the U.S. So you take the entire process of financials and you redo that, and guess what? It's a perfect moment to take a look at a lot of what feeds that process. And basically, it was procurement. It was a bit of a perfect storm, though, because we had John Doran as the CFO that really wanted to see the financials changing. We had a brand new CIO, David Marshall. He actually joined CIBC the same day that I did. And David's idea was to take a look at emerging technologies and how does the bank prepare itself for the emergence of those technologies and do different things. So in essence, he held a fair, and we teamed up with, at the time it was Anderson Consulting, to present procurement as something that could in fact be done very differently. We did work with Ariba, Bobby Lent, who was there, I think his title at the time was evangelist. We worked with Bobby. We actually set up a link between California and Toronto. And, we talked through the technology. And the interesting thing about what David set up was that people got, play money to bet, and then they also got votes. And we got the most play money voted for, and I think it was the second highest number of votes, which told us that the people within the organization wanted to see a change. So it made, we were going to go in this direction anyway, but what we realized then was that we had people that were extremely supportive of going in that direction. But we had to make some strategic decisions. You had Ariba that was very buyer-centric, and you had Commerce One that was very supplier-centric. And we had to basically make a bet as to which way we were gonna go, and it was a bet. We did bet on the team. We bet on where we thought the product was going to go. But what you have to remember in emerging technologies, you're betting on the future. A lot of the stuff you want to see, you can't see yet. And we felt, very fortunate to be able to have an opportunity to influence what Ariba was going to go off and do. But it was a great relationship with, Mark Carlson, Keith Kroc, Rob DeSantis, who is now at Orchestro. So it was kind of the group, and boy, we really rocked and rolled. And it was great on the execution side too. It was terrific working with Anderson Consulting, and we actually had a presentation in New York City at one point where after we did the implementation, and there was a great deal of interest in what we were doing, and I think some good business came up to Anderson Consulting from that.
My wife actually started at Anderson right about that time, and my brother worked for Commerce One at that time, and he'd probably tell you the same thing. You made the right decision. So that's great.
But we didn't know it at the time. We hoped we did.
Well, that brings me to my next question, because you kind of made the bet, and you used the word bet, and I want to stay there kind of for a moment, because you made lots of bets in your career, clearly, and two of the biggest, one related to me specifically, were advisory bets. Coupa Software and DocuSign. I, of course, have fond memories of Coupa. Still love my friendships there and with the people there and the executives who were there and still are. You joined Coupa's advisory board in 2010, 6 years before their IPO. You were a charter member at DocuSign's advisory board, and that's 8 years before theirs. Most people can't pick one unicorn, but you happen to pick two in a row. So what did you see in those companies, and what can you tell the people listening? What did you see in those companies early on that the market hadn't figured out yet?
Well, this goes back, quite frankly, to relationships. So the Coupa connection came, Rob Bernstein went around and spoke to a whole bunch of people. Keith Kroc was one of them. And Keith is a big believer in having advisory boards. And from what I was told, that I was one of the first names that Keith threw out and said, if you're going to have an advisory board, you need to get Jack Miles on it. And Rob actually asked me to go on the advisory board, and it was very, very loosely formed at the time. And then when I actually took the role up in Tallahassee with Governor Scott, I had to resign from that, and then I went back on. Rob reached out to me afterwards, and I went back on. But it was
cool. I didn't know that part.
Yeah, it was a bit of, probably them selecting me and kind of me selecting them in a sense. I felt from an advisory board standpoint, there's got to be something in it for everyone. And I'm looking for some really smart people, some folks that are doing different things, an area where I can contribute and make a bit of a difference. And I saw that certainly in Coupa. The DocuSign thing, of course, Keith became the CEO of DocuSign, and he and Mark Carlson put their heads together. And Mark tells me I was one of the first phone calls they made to be on the advisory board. So a big honor. As a matter of fact, when I look at that board and the folks that were on it, I was just in awe. It was just some amazing, amazing people. So that part of it was really great and a lot of fun.
Just as a side question, tell me about your relationship with Keith. It seems like you guys have built a career a little bit together as well.
Well, I mean, Keith is a great leader. And, when you make bets on companies, the leadership is a big part of it. And that can be a little bit risky because you've got to, also plan for what's the depth in the organization if, in fact, that leader, departs. Keith is a great individual. One of the questions that I asked after we were quite involved with Ariba, and I said, Keith, what can I do for you? And he said, you could actually come to California and talk to some of the developers because they scratch their heads sometimes trying to figure out why people are using this stuff. And I did, and we set aside, just a couple of hours, and it wound up being like double, triple the amount of time that they had set aside. And for me, that's what makes it work, right? You've got. You're giving something to those folks. They're giving you an awful lot, and it's that connection. And a lot of people don't understand that in the procurement space. And but it's there. And Keith's a great individual. I count him as a friend. It's not that we're talking every week, but I know if I reach out to him and I want to have a conversation, I'll hear back from him.
Yeah, that feeling you're describing, it made me smile because that's that feeling of satisfaction. You can get it sometimes when you mow your lawn and you look back and you look at how nice and green it is. And sometimes, specifically, I get it out of those meetings, walking out going, everybody got something meaningful and valuable out of that conversation. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about something that I think is really uniquely yours, because very few people in the world have sat really on both sides. And it's something I learned a lot from you about as well, is the public-private procurement divide. You've managed billion-dollar organizations of global spends in financial services. And then for Governor Rick Scott, appointed you DMS secretary, and that's $9.5 billion in accountability overall. But real estate, private prisons, public prisons, fleet, human resources, telecom, employee benefits, healthcare, retirement, everything. In my world right now, we often think that direct spend is complex and indirect is a little more simple. So walking into that agency, does that make you think, I'm in some parallel universe of spend? What was the biggest shock, and how different did the procurement rulebook look from public to private?
Well, I tend to focus on what's the same versus what's different. And a lot of it's the same, right? You've got a lot of the same stuff that you've got to do. What was striking to me was the quality of the people, and excellent people. However, they weren't really empowered to do anything. Everything had to go through, it's all, checking with the checkers and check the checkers again and that. And what I realized very early on is all you have to do is empower some of those folks to get the job done, and they would go off and do the right thing. Did certain people kind of get pushed aside and off to do something else? Absolutely, that was the case. But in the end, when you look at the procurement process, it's very easy to figure out how we wind up with $640 toilet seats. It's a crazy process in a government because you've got a series of rules. And I kind of use a sports analogy when I think about it, when I talk about it, is that, when you're in a sports situation, if something happens that shouldn't happen and they call a foul, you get the foul, they resolve the issue, and then you move on. Well, with government procurement, it doesn't work that way. The foul comes when you've already decided what you're going to do, and you wind up with somebody putting in a protest. And in quietly speaking with some of the people that actually protested and asking, why the hell do you do this? And they do it basically to get confidential information from their competitors because it's an open book and all that information has to be provided. So, the system in government is somewhat broken in the way it's done. I also served on the Florida Government Efficiency Task Force, and we proposed a whole bunch of changes to the procurement system and process. But
among other things, yeah.
Exactly. And that was another esteemed group. It was a great group of people. So, Yeah, the protest process was a challenge. I mean, we had a major one that I was actively involved in around healthcare. So when I arrived at the agency, they were behind the eight ball in getting and procuring basically the healthcare programs for state employees. And we were up against a deadline. It was really tight, and we did the procurement. It happened, and immediately there was a protest, and it was an example of what some of the stuff we had to deal with. So not used to protest. It was early in my role. Brought in the legal people and the folks from State Group Insurance, and I said, so explain this process to me. And they did. We talked about, lawyers, and the one question I asked is, are we going to get out lawyered here? My general counsel said nothing, and his assistant said, absolutely. And I looked at her and I said, so what do we do? And we brainstormed a little bit, and I said, how about this? What is a firm that's come up against us a bunch of times and prevailed? They threw out the name, and I said, want to talk to the senior partner there. We did. They were unencumbered. They didn't have any conflicts. They were a little bit scratching their head why we chose them, but we went through the process with them, and we had a strategy to bring this to closure quickly to address what we had to address for state employees. So, you're in court. You got to you basically can't do anything. You can't sign anything. And then you get a window of time where you can. And I was actually traveling around the state at the time. I had every contract in my briefcase. And when we had a period in which we could actually sign an agreement, we signed it, did it. And in the end, the company, I won't mention them, but the company that actually initiated the protest came to us and said, look, we really want to settle, and these are the counties we like. And we said, well, here are the counties that are left, and there's only one. So we used a strategy versus, just kind of doing battle. It was, you got to have a strategy to kind of get this stuff done. And we had a good strategy, and it worked. And that person that wound up giving us the good advice inside wound up being kind of the general counsel, and she took over State Group Insurance. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. You've seen that protest process from one side and from the other side, specifically in the state of Florida too. And I'm very intimate with that process.
Yep. It's painful.
It is. It's very painful, but hopefully there's some improvements coming across the board in some of those areas. Now let's go to a different subject, and let's go where everyone in our audience is really thinking about these days, and I hate to say the dreaded AI word. You've been an early adopter though, and this is why I wanted to go there. We talked about the Ariba connection, but your whole career, it's been an early adopter. And now you're an executive advisor at Orchestra, which really is doing something genuinely different with AI and game theory in procurement. So I really wanted to get your honest read for everybody listening, and not the vendor pitch, not the conference keynote version, but your real view. Are we at an inflection point? Or are we at another hype circle where the technology is just 10 years ahead of the organizations that are supposed to be using it?
Yeah, I really believe we're at an inflection point. There's a saying that everything that comes in threes is complete. I'm not suggesting the third one is going to be the complete one, but if you look at where we were, we basically had, you licensed software, you got a bunch of CDs, you loaded them up, you customized it because you could, and you did all kinds of stuff with it. And when we were going through that, I remember saying to John Doran, I said, "There's got to be a better freaking way here. This is just crazy." And at the time, my desire was to actually be able to utilize the technology, and a saying that I've used quite a bit is buy by the drink, not by the bottle. So pay per transactions, right, that go through, maybe an easier sort of process. But anyway, we went through that. We learned, and sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. But then all of a sudden, what came next? It was basically the cloud. And it was best in class software that you basically implemented. You could make some modifications and tweaks, but they kind of designed it because they didn't want you making a whole bunch of changes. It was too bloody expensive to do. And so we went through that. And there was a lot of resistance to that. There was the on-premise, off-premise, there were all kinds of challenges around it. And where I think we are now is with the AI side, is that we're on the third phase of this. The thing that is so interesting to me is the ability to do things that I wish we had been able to do years ago, but we couldn't justify the time, the effort, and the resources to put in it.
That's right. Good point.
You go after, it's the old line, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. Well, when you're dealing with procurement, what do you go after? You go after the big stuff. And that makes sense to do that. But what's amazing to me is that there's so much of the little stuff. And, when you're in a large corporation, it's $1 million here and $1 million there. But when you're looking at 15, 20, 25% on that $1 million, it's real money.
Right.
There's a tremendous amount of gold to mine in those areas, but we just don't have the bandwidth to be able to do it. And I do think that, the machine learning, the AI and everything else, a lot of this stuff is not, sorry to my procurement colleagues, but it's not rocket science, right? And if you've got the ability to be able to do a lot more, probably do it better. Because you're going to, if it's done properly, you're going to have good guidelines and good guardrails. And you look at surgery today with doctors. Nancy had 2 knee replacements and it's robotic, generated. Well, how do you explain that? Well, the way I explain it is that it creates a field of operation for the doctor, and he can't color outside the lines.
Right.
He has to stay inside. And it's the same thing with AI, and it's the same way with procurement, where you set the rules. You've got to stay within the guidelines that exist, and you'll be able to do it with far less people for sure and get some awesome outcomes.
Yeah, doing more with less seems like something that Orchestra is delivering in one area. And then you've got some other areas and some other standout companies really coming up, the Green Cabbages of the world in that area, in a totally separate area. And then even like the Delineus doing it in should cost modeling. So very cool stuff.
And I think you're going to start seeing companies that are going to come in and actually have help companies develop sort of their own agents to do things and structure them in their own way. And that's going to be another slice of this business that my guess is will probably wind up being merged into the folks that are actually doing the AI procurement, but time will tell.
Yeah, we're already seeing some of that, at some of the professional services firms that you and I are familiar with in the Big Four, Deloitte doing that, and some of the others are making some really cool additions inside of organizations with them. So it's pretty neat. So I want to give you the last word on something personal. You've mentored kind of a generation of procurement leaders. You've watched this profession, go from paper catalogs to, AI-driven negotiation engines for, just as an example. You served in county or country, state, in some of the largest institutions, financial services and otherwise in the world. What is the thing or the one piece of wisdom, a good piece of wisdom, you'd most want the next generation listening of procurement professionals specifically to carry with them? Is there something that you wish you had told yourself, or back on that flight deck in 1970, told yourself that you would want to remember today?
Yeah, I did some thinking about this, Ian, and it's pretty simple.
Good.
I think
that's what the questions are for.
It's courage. People need to have courage to do the right thing, and it's hard. As I said earlier, sometimes folks are in procurement because it's a job. I was in it because very early in my career, I realized that if I could differentiate myself slightly from the rest of the people in the business, it was back in the Prentice Hall days, it could probably be a pretty good career. And for me, it turned out to be that. And I did have to exert courage. There were decisions that I had to make many times to say, do I stay and do this, or do I do something else? If the organization doesn't want to embrace the change, then guess what? Go someplace else. And I mean that seriously.
DMS, it required courage.
It was courage.
Coming from the private, to the public, that's courage.
Well, one of my colleagues with one of the roles that I went into and said, Jack, why the hell are you going there? And I said, because I know many people that have tried before and they haven't been able to do it. And I'm pretty sure I can. And, when I say courage, it's also, it's serious because, and this has happened to me on several occasions where people come gunning for you. I mean, you're upsetting the apple cart. You're changing the things that they think is their role, and they believe that you're restricting them. And frankly, if procurement restricts anybody in an organization, they're doomed to failure, right? What you've got to do is enable it, and you've got to work with them, and you might have to work hard to get them to modify their thoughts and approach, and had to do that many times. But in the end, you're there as a partner of theirs, but they will see that as a threat, and given the opportunity, they will come after you. And you basically need to have the courage to endure that and work through the process. And that's where you need somebody to really be supportive at the top of the house, to make sure that if noise starts to happen or the tom-toms start to pound, they've got to step in and do the right thing to address it. Does the organization want to deal with the fundamental change, or don't they? And if they don't, that's fine. Just move on.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Well, Jack, before I let you go, we could keep going on actually, because it's been excellent. But I want to take it out of the boardroom just for a second. I know you and Nancy have been doing a lot of serious exploring, cruises, new corners of the world. Where has life been taking you to lately? And does Nancy let you actually do any part of the itinerary, or is it all her?
We do it jointly. But Nancy does. She's kind of the hunter on this stuff. I mean, I've been fortunate in my life to have Nancy. We've moved several times. Nancy was born in Hawaii. We met in Puerto Rico, so she's been all over the place. And when a job opportunity came up, and it was what do you want to do? Nancy never said no. And when it came to the houses, she was the hunter. She would go out and do it. So there's things that I do well, and there's things that I don't do well, and I think we complement ourselves in a lot of ways. But Nancy's been great, and she is a great planner, and it's fun. I do work on the itineraries though to make sure that everything is kind of laid out so we're pretty well organized.
I love that. I've got to tell you that I was thinking about earlier. I was going to ask you about potentially the secret of a good marriage, and in a roundabout way, you just actually got to it anyway. So that's awesome. That's great. I love it. So I know Jess is out there forging her own path. Nancy's running circles around everybody at DAR, which is incredible, by the way. The Miles family clearly doesn't know how to stand still, but that's a testament to you, I think, Jack. That's kind of the perfect note, I think, to end on. The Crack Institute's motto is 5 words, right? It's technology must advance freedom. I think you've lived that across every chapter, from the flight deck to Tallahassee into the boardrooms and now in AI at Orchestro. In procurement, maybe that just means freedom from bad data, broken processes, or the vendor has locked you up, like you discussed earlier, in a no exit ramp. It's as simple as that, I think. But I just want to thank you, Jack, for joining me. Fair winds and following seas, my friend.
Thanks, Ian. I really appreciate it, and thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jack.